The stars over the Velisari Concord had always been calm. For 10,000 years, the Concord ruled a wide stretch of the galaxy, home to 100 alien worlds bound together by trade, culture, and old alliances. But calm skies do not last forever. On the edge of Concord space, a new enemy had come out of the dark. The people called them the Grave Swarm, because everywhere they passed, they left only graves. The Grave Swarm did not talk, they did not ask for surrender, they simply came, wave after wave of black ships shaped like broken teeth, and they erased whatever stood in their path. Planets that had stood for centuries turned silent in days. Fleets that had trained for 100 years were gone in hours. The Concord's generals, proud and confident only a year before, now spoke in whispers, because every plan they tried had failed. On the command deck of the Concorde flagship Aurel Vantis, an old admiral named Threl Cassia stood before a wall of screens showing the war. Red lights marked worlds already lost. Orange lights marked worlds under attack. Only a few green lights remained, and even those blinked weakly, like candles about to go out. Threl Cassia had fought in 3 wars before this one. None of them looked like this. "Another colony fell this morning," said her aide, a younger officer named Doran Vey. His voice was flat, tired from too many bad reports. The Grave Swarm did not even slow down. "Our shield stations lasted 11 minutes. Threl closed her eyes for a moment. 11 minutes. Her scientists had built those shields to survive a full day of siege. The math no longer mattered. Nothing they built seemed to matter. "Show me the sector map," she said. Doran brought it up. The picture was worse than she expected. The Grave Swarm's main fleet was now less than 40 days from the Concorde's capital world, Velisar Prime, the heart of their civilization, home to 9 billion people. "We cannot stop them with what we have," Doran said quietly. "Command already knows this. That is why they called the council session tonight." The council session was not really a council anymore. It was a room full of frightened leaders, trying to decide how their people should die. Threl walked into the chamber 2 hours later, and found it half empty. Many seats belonged to representatives from worlds that no longer existed. An old scholar named Yeth Ambrai stood at the center of the room. He was not a soldier. He studied history, old records, and lost civilizations. For years, people had called his work useless. Tonight, everyone listened. "I have spent my whole life reading about the small, forgotten species scattered across the galaxy," Yeth said. "Most of them are peaceful. Most of them stay quiet and hidden, afraid of bigger powers. But there is one species I have studied more than any other. A species that nobody respects because they are young, loud, and disorganized. A species from a planet called Earth." A murmur passed through the room. Someone laughed bitterly. "Humans? The ones who cannot even agree with each other on their own world? You want to ask them for help?" Yeth did not back down. "Yes, because unlike us, humans have never known peace long enough to forget how to fight. Their entire history is war after war, disaster after disaster, and yet they always survive. They do not run from danger. They build. They adapt. They find a way, even when there should not be one." Another counselor scoffed. "They have barely left their own solar system. Their ships are toys compared to ours." "Our ships were not toys," Threl said quietly, cutting through the room, and the Grave Swarm broke them like glass. Silence fell. Nobody had an answer to that. Yeth continued, his voice steady. "I am not saying humans have better ships. I am saying they have something we lost a long time ago. We built peace so carefully that we forgot what it cost to defend it. Humans never had that comfort. They know how to fight when there is nothing left to lose." The council argued for hours. Some called it madness to trust an unknown species with the survival of a civilization. Others said there was nothing left to lose by trying. In the end, desperation won the argument, as it always does when the alternative is extinction. They chose a young diplomat named Sela Rin to carry the message. She was nervous, new to her position, but she had studied Earth's languages more than anyone else on the council. When they told her she would fly a scout ship straight to an unknown alien world with no protection, she did not hesitate. She understood, better than most, that hesitation was now a luxury nobody could afford. The scout ship left Velisar Prime under cover of a dying twilight, slipping past patrols and quietly crossing the dark distance between stars. Sela did not know if she would survive the journey, or if humans would even listen when she arrived. But she carried something more important than fear, a recording, prepared with everything the Concorde scientists knew about Earth, warning signs of the grave swarm's path, and a simple request written in careful human words. "We are dying. We ask for your help." Weeks passed in silence and starlight. Sella's ship crossed empty systems, avoided patrol routes, and pushed her old engines harder than they were built for. When Earth's solar system finally appeared on her scanners, she felt something she had not felt in a long time: hope. She sent her signal ahead of her, broadcasting on every frequency she could reach, hoping someone on the strange blue planet would understand. Her ship's old systems began flashing warnings as she entered Earth's atmosphere too fast, damaged from the long journey. She adjusted the descent as best she could, aiming for open water instead of a crowded coastline, praying the landing would not kill her before her message could be heard. The ship hit the Pacific Ocean with a violent splash, sending up a wall of water that could be seen from passing satellites within seconds. Within minutes, military channels across multiple nations lit up with alerts. Something had fallen from space. Something was still moving inside it. Sella barely stayed conscious as her ship's hull groaned under the pressure. She pulled herself toward the emergency hatch, coughing from smoke, gripping the message recording tightly in one hand. When the hatch finally opened, salt water rushed in, but she did not care. She climbed out onto the floating wreck of her ship and looked up at an alien sky, an alien sun, and in the distance, human ships rushing toward her position, lights flashing, engines roaring. She had made it. Now she only had to hope that the species everyone doubted would choose to listen. On the deck of a nearby Coast Guard vessel, a young officer named Alex Ruiz stood frozen, staring through binoculars at the strange shape floating on the water. He had seen a lot of strange things in his years of service, but nothing like this. The ship's captain barked orders, but Alex could not stop staring at the figure standing on the wreck, waving both arms toward them, clearly desperate to be seen. "Sir," Alex said slowly, lowering his binoculars. "I don't think that's human." The captain grabbed the binoculars from him and looked for himself. For a long moment, nobody on the ship said a word. Then the captain grabbed his radio and called it in, his voice tight with disbelief. "Command, this is Coast Guard Cutter Resolute. We need immediate backup at these coordinates. We have contact. Repeat, we have first contact." Within hours, the news reached governments across the world. Within a day, it reached every screen on the planet. Humanity, a species that could barely agree on anything, suddenly found itself staring at the same impossible truth together. They were not alone in the universe, and somewhere out there, an ancient civilization was dying, and had chosen to ask them, of all people, for help. Nobody knew yet what humanity would decide to do, but far above the ocean, watching the growing crowd of ships and lights gathering around the crash site, Sella Rin allowed herself a small, tired smile. The message had been delivered. Whatever happened next was no longer in her hands. The fate of two civilizations now rested on the answer of a species that history had always underestimated. The alien woman pulled from the Pacific Ocean was taken to a secure facility within hours, surrounded by scientists, soldiers, and translators trying to make sense of what had happened. Sella Rin, still weak from her journey, handed over her recording device before she even understood the language well enough to explain herself. It did not matter. The message inside spoke clearly enough once human engineers managed to decode its format. The recording showed images of burning cities, broken fleets, and a black tide of enemy ships sweeping across the stars. It showed numbers, timelines, and a simple plea, translated into rough but understandable English. "We are dying. We ask for your help." Within a day, every major government on Earth had a copy of that message. Within 2 days, an emergency session of the United Nations was called, though few people believed anything productive would come from it. Humanity had never been good at agreeing on anything, not climate policy, not trade, not borders. Now they were being asked to agree on whether to send their people to fight and possibly die for a species none of them had ever heard of. In a crowded conference room in New York, diplomats argued for hours. Some said it was reckless to commit military resources to an unknown alien war. Others said, humanity could not simply ignore proof that intelligent life across the galaxy was being wiped out, especially not when that same threat might one day reach Earth itself. A representative from Brazil stood and said something that would later be repeated in news reports around the world. If we wait until the monster is at our own door, it will already be too late to build a weapon strong enough to stop it. Better we learn how to fight it far from home, on someone else's battlefield, than wait to fight it on our own. The argument continued, but something strange began happening outside the halls of government. While politicians debated, ordinary people and military leaders had already started acting. Defense ministries across multiple countries began quietly moving ships and resources, preparing for the possibility of war, before any formal vote had been taken. Engineers pulled blueprints for old prototype warships out of storage. Retired officers were called back into service. Shipyards that had been slow for years suddenly filled with workers running double shifts. It was not unity born from agreement. It was unity born from instinct. Humanity had spent thousands of years fighting itself, learning how to build machines of war faster than almost any other kind of technology. Faced with a threat bigger than any nation, something old and practical kicked in before politics could catch up. Within a week, the vote passed. Nations that had not cooperated on anything in decades signed agreements to combine their militaries into a single force. They called it the Legion Fleet, a name chosen quickly during a late-night meeting because nobody had time to argue about something as small as a name. Ships came from everywhere. The United States offered its newest experimental carriers, built for deep space testing but never approved for full deployment. Russia contributed heavily armored vessels originally designed as orbital defense platforms. China sent fast, agile warships built around advanced railgun technology. Smaller nations pooled resources to build support ships, medical vessels, and repair stations. Private companies, eager to be part of history, donated advanced materials and experimental engines that had been sitting unused due to cost or risk. Sela Rin watched all of this from a secure viewing room, still adjusting to her new surroundings, still learning to speak English well enough to have real conversations. She had expected careful planning, long negotiations, endless committees deciding every small detail before a single ship moved. Instead, she watched a species argue loudly about paint colors and ship names while somehow still managing to finish construction projects ahead of schedule. "You do not fully understand what a threat you are facing," she told a group of military officials during one of her first briefings. "The Grave Swarm does not negotiate. It does not retreat. Your ships must be ready for total war, not limited conflict." An admiral named James Whitfield, a tall man with graying hair and a calm voice that carried authority without needing to shout, looked at her steadily. "Ma'am, we've been fighting total wars against each other for most of our history. We know what that costs. We just never had a reason to point all of it in the same direction before." Sela studied him carefully. She had read reports about human military history during her long journey to Earth, prepared quickly by Concord researchers, but seeing it in person felt different. There was no hesitation in his eyes, no fear of the unknown enemy waiting for them, only quiet determination. Over the following weeks, the Legion fleet began to take shape at an unprecedented pace. Shipyards in orbit around Earth worked around the clock. Engineers studied fragments of Concord technology that Sela provided, adapting alien shielding systems and weapon designs into human ships wherever possible, blending them with existing human engineering. The process was chaotic. Arguments broke out constantly between engineers from different countries who disagreed on design philosophies. American engineers wanted heavier armor and slower, powerful ships. Japanese and South Korean teams pushed for speed and precision strikes. European teams focused on defensive systems and long-range communication networks. Instead of slowing progress, these disagreements somehow produced a fleet built from many different strengths stitched together into something stronger than any single approach alone. Soldiers from dozens of nations trained together for the first time, learning to fight as one unit, despite language barriers and cultural differences. It was not smooth. Fights broke out in training camps. Old rivalries occasionally surfaced. But slowly, painfully, something resembling unity began to form, forged not through shared culture, but through shared purpose. Sela watched the ships being named as construction finished. Instead of numbers or letters like Concord ships used, humans gave their vessels names pulled from ancient stories and mythology. She saw ships named Ragnarok, Valkyrie, Kali, Fenrir, and Excalibur. When she asked why, A young engineer laughed and told her that humans liked reminding themselves of old stories about heroes facing impossible odds, because it made the real fight feel a little less frightening. "Your species is strange," Sella admitted during a private conversation with Admiral Whitfield one evening, watching workers assemble the final sections of the flagship, a massive vessel later named Aegis Ascendant. "You joke before battle. You build ships named after gods and monsters. You argue about small details while somehow finishing enormous projects faster than my people ever could." Whitfield smiled slightly, watching sparks fly from welding equipment high above them. "Maybe that's exactly why we can help you. Your people built peace so carefully that war became a distant memory. We never had that luxury. We know how ugly this fight is going to be, and we're building for that ugliness, not pretending it won't happen." 3 months after Sella's ship crashed into the Pacific Ocean, the Legion fleet stood ready. 94 ships gathered in high orbit above Earth, representing the combined military strength of a species that had never once, in its recorded history, fully united for a single cause. Soldiers stood on observation decks looking down at their home planet, many of them silently wondering if they would ever see it again. Sella stood beside Admiral Whitfield on the bridge of the Aegis Ascendant as the fleet prepared for its first jump toward Concord space. She thought of her own people, waiting desperately for help that might arrive too late, or might arrive exactly in time to change everything. "Are you afraid?" she asked quietly. Whitfield looked out at the stars, at the assembled fleet glowing faintly under Earth's sunlight. Ships built by rival nations, now standing together for the first time in human history. "Every soldier who's ever mattered was afraid before a fight," he said. "Fear just means you understand what's at stake. What matters is what you do next." The order came through the fleet's communication system moments later, calm and steady despite the historic weight of what was about to happen. "Legion Fleet, this is command. You are cleared for departure. Godspeed." Engines roared to life across 94 ships at once. Space around Earth's orbit shimmered as experimental jump drives, built from a combination of human engineering and borrowed Concorde schematics, powered up in unison. Sella gripped the edge of her console, watching Earth shrink behind them, as the fleet prepared to cross the stars toward a war none of them fully understood yet. Humanity, divided for its entire history, had finally found something powerful enough to unite it, even if only for now. Whether that unity would be enough to save 2 civilizations instead of losing both, nobody yet knew. The jump through open space took 11 days, far longer than anyone on the Legion fleet had experienced before. Human jump drives, newly built and only partly understood, struggled to match the smoothness of Concorde technology. Ships shook during transitions, systems overheated. Twice, engineers had to make emergency repairs mid-jump while soldiers held their breath in dark corridors, lit only by emergency lighting. But the fleet held together, and on the 11th day, 94 human warships dropped out of jump space at the edge of Concorde territory. What greeted them was silence, and worse than silence, wreckage. Fields of broken ships drifted in the dark, remains of Concorde fleets that had tried to hold this border and failed. Sella Rin stood on the bridge of the Aegis Ascendant, staring at the destruction with an expression Admiral Whitfield had not seen on her before. It was not fear, it was grief. "This was the Threlin line," she said quietly. 12,000 ships defended this border once. I studied its history as a child. It was supposed to be unbreakable. Whitfield studied the wreckage on his display, noting weapon damage patterns, hull fractures, and burn marks that told a story of overwhelming force applied without mercy. "Nothing built by anyone stays unbreakable forever," he said. "Question is what breaks it, and how fast we can learn from that before it happens to us." Concorde escort ships met them soon after, smaller and more cautious than expected. Their crews had clearly seen too much recently to trust anything new easily, even allies they had personally requested. A Concorde officer named Vesic Thorn led the welcoming delegation, an experienced tactician with tired eyes and a stiff, formal manner that barely hid his skepticism. "You arrived faster than projected," Vesic said during the first meeting aboard the Aegis Ascendant, studying the human officers around him carefully. "Admiral Cassia expected your fleet would need additional months to organize properly." "We didn't have months to spare," Whitfield replied simply. Vesic's eyes flicked toward the assembled human officers, noting their mixed uniforms. their casual body language, the way junior officers occasionally made quiet jokes, despite the seriousness of the briefing. He did not look impressed. Your fleet lacks uniform command structure. Your ships use inconsistent weapon systems. Frankly, Admiral, I do not understand how your people intend to survive contact with the Grave Swarm, let alone defeat them. Sella stepped forward before Whitfield could respond, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. Vesic, I have spent months among these people. Their ways are strange to us, yes, but so was defeat, once, and now defeat is all we have left. Give them a chance before you judge them. The Concord command staff arranged a joint strategy session soon after, hoping to establish clear protocols before engaging the enemy. Admiral Threll Cassia herself attended, studying the human commanders carefully throughout the meeting. She listened as Concord tacticians laid out careful, methodical plans built around caution, defensive formations, and slow, deliberate advances designed to minimize risk. When it came time for human input, Whitfield stood and outlined a very different approach. He proposed sending a smaller strike group ahead of the main fleet to probe enemy defenses directly, gathering real combat data rather than relying purely on theoretical models and second-hand reports. Vesic immediately objected. That is needlessly aggressive. We do not yet understand this enemy's full capabilities. Rushing forward without complete information invites disaster. With respect, Whitfield said calmly, your people have been studying this enemy carefully for over a year, and the Threllan line still fell in days. Sometimes the only way to truly understand an enemy is to test them directly and adapt based on what actually happens, not what we predict might happen. The room fell into tense debate. Some Concord officers agreed cautiously with the human approach, desperate for any strategy different from the ones that had already failed them. Others argued strongly against it, worried that reckless human tactics would cost more lives than careful Concord planning ever had. Admiral Cassia finally spoke, her voice cutting through the argument with quiet authority. We have tried caution. Caution built the Threllan line, and caution watched it fall in less than a day. I am willing to try something different, Admiral Whitfield. But understand this, if your strategy fails, the cost will be measured in lives, both human and Velisari. I understand, Whitfield said simply. That's why I intend to lead the strike group myself. That decision alone changed how many Concord officers viewed the human fleet. Sella noticed the shift immediately, subtle but real, as word spread that the human admiral intended to personally risk his life on the first mission, rather than send others ahead while remaining safely behind. 3 days later, a strike group of 12 human ships, supported by a handful of Concord escort vessels under Vesic's reluctant command, moved toward a smaller Concord colony, currently under Grave Swarm attack. Intelligence suggested the enemy force there was smaller than the main fleet, an opportunity to gather real combat data without facing the full weight of the Grave Swarm's power. The approach was tense. Concord sensors detected the enemy fleet first. 31 black ships arranged in a slow, methodical formation around the besieged colony, firing on the planet's surface with cold, mechanical precision. There was no chaos in their movement, no hesitation, only relentless, patient destruction. Enemy formation confirmed, Vesic reported over the shared communication channel, his voice tight. Recommend immediate withdrawal to reassess. Their numbers exceed our projections. Belay that, Whitfield said calmly. Ragnarok, Valkyrie, prepare for flanking maneuver. Kali, Fenrir, hold formation and draw their attention forward. The plan unfolded exactly as briefed, but nothing could fully prepare the Concord observers for what happened next. Human ships moved with aggressive, unpredictable patterns, unlike anything in Concord battle doctrine, cutting sharp angles, exploiting blind spots in enemy sensor coverage, coordinating attacks through rapid verbal communication, rather than pre-programmed tactical algorithms. The Grave Swarm's response was immediate and mechanical, adjusting formation with cold efficiency to counter the perceived threat. But human tactics kept shifting faster than the enemy could fully adapt, exploiting the smallest hesitations in their otherwise flawless coordination. They're predictable once you push them, Whitfield said calmly over the comm channel, watching real-time data stream across his display. They react to threats in almost the exact same pattern every time. Fenrir, Kali, target their flanking units directly. Force them to choose between defense and offense. Vesic watched from his escort ship, stunned by what he was witnessing. Concord doctrine emphasized careful, measured engagement, avoiding unnecessary risk at every stage. Human tactics embraced risk deliberately, using unpredictability itself as a weapon. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes. When it ended, 11 Grave Swarm ships had been destroyed or disabled, more damage inflicted in that short engagement than several previous Concord fleets had managed in far longer battles. Human losses were not light, 2 ships heavily damaged, dozens of soldiers wounded, but far lower than Concord tacticians had predicted. More importantly, the colony below survived, its remaining defenses given enough breathing room to evacuate thousands of civilians before the Grave Swarm forces regrouped and eventually withdrew, rather than face continued losses. Aboard his escort ship, Vesic Thorn sat in stunned silence for a long moment before finally speaking into his comm. "Admiral Whitfield, that was unconventional." "We call it improvising," Whitfield replied simply, though exhaustion was clear in his voice. "Wasn't perfect. We lost people we shouldn't have, but we learned things about that enemy today that no report could have taught us." Back aboard the Aegis Ascendant, Sella watched recordings of the battle with quiet amazement, alongside Admiral Cassia, who had traveled to observe the human fleet's operations firsthand. "They fight like cornered animals," Cassia said softly, though there was no insult in her tone, only genuine reassessment. "Desperate, clever, unwilling to accept defeat even when the odds suggest they should. That is exactly what they are," Sella replied. "A species that has spent its entire history refusing to accept defeat, even against itself." Cassia was silent for a long moment, watching footage of human ships weaving through enemy fire with reckless precision. "Perhaps," she finally said, "that stubbornness is exactly what our galaxy has been missing." Word of the battle spread quickly through the Concord fleet, and slowly, cautiously, doubt began to shift into something resembling respect. The humans were not the disciplined, technologically superior saviors many had hoped for. They were something rougher, messier, and far more dangerous than anyone had expected. For the first time since the war began, whispers of hope spread through Concord ranks, carried alongside a new phrase soldiers had already begun repeating after witnessing the battle firsthand. "They fight like the old stories, like legends forged from desperation itself." The war against the Grave Swarm had only just begun, but something had shifted in that first engagement, a quiet realization shared by humans and Velisari alike. This alliance, chaotic and unconventional as it was, might actually stand a chance. News of the human victory at the colony spread quickly across Concord space, carried by refugee ships and military reports, moving faster than official channels could control. By the time the Legion fleet reached its next major deployment, soldiers and civilians across dozens of worlds had already heard stories about the strange new allies who fought like cornered wolves and somehow kept winning. Admiral Whitfield did not have time to enjoy the growing reputation. Intelligence reports arrived within days, describing a much larger Grave Swarm force moving toward Halvanar, a heavily populated Concord world serving as a major evacuation hub. Nearly 2 million refugees from fallen colonies had gathered there, waiting for transport further into safer Concord territory. If Halvanar fell before evacuation ships arrived, the death toll would be catastrophic. The combined fleet moved immediately, human and Concord ships traveling together for the first time as a fully integrated force, rather than separate commands loosely coordinating. Vesic Thorn, who had grown quietly more respectful of human tactics since the earlier battle, now served directly under Whitfield's command structure, translating human strategy into terms Concord crews could follow more naturally. "The evacuation fleet needs at least 6 more hours to load remaining civilians," Vesic reported, as their combined force approached Halvanar's outer defense perimeter. "Grave Swarm forces will arrive in approximately 90 minutes. Whitfield studied the tactical display grimly. 63 enemy ships approached in their usual disciplined formation, more than double the size of the force they had faced before. Behind them, Halvanar's remaining defenses, badly weakened from earlier attacks, prepared for what many feared would be their final stand. "We can't outgun them," Whitfield said, thinking quickly. "Not directly. We need to buy time, not win a straight fight." Sella, standing nearby aboard the Aegis Ascendant, frowned at the numbers. 63 warships against our combined 41. "Even with your tactics, the math does not favor us." "Math doesn't win wars," Whitfield replied. "Timing does." He called an emergency strategy session, gathering both human and Concord commanders together. The plan he proposed was risky, relying heavily on deception and precise timing rather than raw firepower. Human engineers had recently adapted Concorde's sensor jamming technology into something more aggressive, capable of creating false ship signatures across a wide area. If we can convince the Grave Swarm that a much larger fleet is approaching from a second direction, their pattern analysis should force them to split forces to address the perceived threat, Whitfield explained, pointing at simulated data on the display. The burrito was cold. That buys the evacuation fleet critical extra time and reduces the numbers we actually have to fight directly. Vesic studied the plan carefully. Their tactical algorithms are extremely disciplined. There's no guarantee they will fall for false sensor readings. No guarantee, Whitfield admitted. But from what we saw in the first engagement, they follow strict threat response patterns. If it looks like a real threat on their sensors, standard protocol suggests they'll respond as if it is one, at least until proven otherwise. Admiral Cassia, still cautious but increasingly willing to trust human unpredictability, gave her approval. Within the hour, human engineering teams worked feverishly to configure sensor arrays aboard 3 modified support ships, preparing to broadcast false fleet signatures large enough to convince enemy scanners that a second, more powerful force approached from Halvanar's far side. The battle began exactly on schedule. Grave Swarm ships advanced on Halvanar with their usual cold precision, beginning bombardment of the planet's failing shield network within minutes. Then the false signals activated, painting phantom warships across enemy sensor arrays, approaching from an unexpected angle. For nearly 2 full minutes, nothing happened, and Whitfield feared the deception had failed entirely. Then, exactly as predicted, roughly a third of the Grave Swarm fleet broke formation, redirecting to intercept the phantom threat. "It's working," Sella said, watching the tactical display with cautious excitement. "They're responding exactly like Admiral Whitfield predicted." "Don't celebrate yet," Whitfield warned. "Now comes the hard part." With enemy numbers reduced and their formation disrupted, the combined human and Concorde fleet moved in directly, engaging the remaining Grave Swarm ships in close, chaotic combat. Human vessels once again used unpredictable maneuvers, breaking Concorde formation doctrine deliberately to confuse enemy targeting systems, while Concorde ships provided steady, disciplined covering fire that stabilized the battlefield. It was messy, loud, and dangerous. 2 human ships took heavy damage within the first 10 minutes. A Concorde cruiser lost its engines entirely, drifting helplessly until nearby ships could provide emergency cover. But slowly, painfully, the combined fleet began pushing the reduced enemy force back from Halvanar's orbit. Aboard the Ragnarok, a young human pilot named Marcus Webb found himself in the middle of the fiercest fighting, weaving his fighter craft between enemy fire while providing support for larger capital ships. His squadron had trained together for barely 2 months before deployment, yet somehow, the chaos of real combat had forged them into something sharper than months of peacetime drills ever could. Multiple bogies converging on Fenrir's port side, Marcus called out over squadron comms, watching his sensors light up with incoming threats. "They're trying to flank the capital ships while our attention's split." "Copy that, Webb," replied his squadron leader. "Let's give them something else to worry about." What followed was not part of any official battle plan. Marcus's squadron broke from their assigned position, cutting directly toward the flanking enemy ships in a maneuver that violated at least 3 separate tactical protocols. It worked, buying critical seconds for the Fenrir's crew to reroute power to damaged shield sections before the flanking attack could finish them off. Similar moments repeated across the battlefield throughout the engagement, small acts of improvisation and sacrifice that no strategist could have planned in advance, yet somehow added up to something greater than careful calculation alone could achieve. 90 minutes after the battle began, the evacuation fleet completed its final loading and departed Halvanar's orbit safely, carrying nearly 2 million refugees toward protected Concorde territory. Shortly after, with their numerical advantage eliminated and losses mounting faster than their tactical models had predicted, the remaining Grave Swarm forces withdrew entirely, retreating back toward unknown territory, rather than continuing an increasingly costly engagement. It was not a total victory. Both human and Concorde fleets suffered serious losses, and several ships would require extensive repairs before returning to active duty. But Halvanar had survived, its evacuation completed successfully, and the Grave Swarm had retreated for the first time since the war began. That night, aboard the heavily damaged but still functional Aegis Ascendant, exhausted crews from both fleets gathered informally in the ship's largest cargo bay, hastily converted into a temporary gathering space. Human soldiers shared rations and dark jokes about the day's chaos, while Concord soldiers, initially hesitant, slowly began joining the conversations, trading stories about their own homes and losses. Sella found herself sitting beside Marcus Webb, listening as he described the flanking maneuver his squadron had improvised during the battle, laughing quietly despite the exhaustion clearly written across his face. "You could have died doing that," she said, still adjusting to human humor in moments like this. "Yeah, probably," Marcus admitted with a tired shrug. "But the alternative was definitely losing that ship, and everyone on it. Sometimes the crazy option is actually the safer bet, when you look at it that way." Sella shook her head slowly, though something like a smile crossed her face. "My people would never approve of that kind of thinking during official planning sessions." "Good thing we're not big on official planning sessions," Marcus replied, grinning despite everything. Word of the battle at Halvanar spread even faster than the first engagement had. Refugees who had witnessed the fighting firsthand described human ships fighting with a strange, fearless intensity, unlike anything the Concord's disciplined military doctrine had ever produced. Soldiers began referring to the combined fleet using a new name, one that would eventually be recorded permanently in Concord military history. The Forged Fleet, they called it, born not from careful planning and generations of peaceful tradition, but forged directly from desperation, chaos, and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat, exactly the way legends were always supposed to begin. Admiral Cassia, reviewing battle reports late that night alongside Whitfield, finally allowed herself a rare moment of genuine hope. 2 battles won, 2 impossible situations survived. Perhaps Yeth Ambrai was right about your people after all. Whitfield studied the growing list of ship repairs and casualty reports, well aware that whatever legend was forming around his fleet, the true cost of this war had barely begun. "We've survived 2 fights," he said quietly. "That doesn't mean we've found a way to win this war yet, but we're learning. And so far, that's kept us alive." Outside, in the vast darkness surrounding Halvanar, wreckage from the battle drifted silently among the stars, a grim reminder of exactly how much more difficult the road ahead would be, even as whispered stories of a fleet forged from legend continued spreading across a galaxy desperate for hope. 3 months after the battle at Halvanar, the war had settled into a grinding, exhausting rhythm. The Forged Fleet, as both humans and Concord forces now openly called it, had fought a dozen more engagements across the border territories, winning most, losing pieces of itself each time, regardless of outcome. Ships were repaired and sent back into battle faster than proper maintenance schedules allowed. Soldiers slept in shifts, ate whatever rations were available, and grew increasingly tired in ways that no victory seemed able to fully repair. Despite the growing list of successful battles, something troubled Admiral Whitfield deeply. The Grave Swarm never seemed to run out of ships. No matter how many enemy vessels the Forged Fleet destroyed, more always appeared within weeks, following the exact same tactical patterns, the exact same emotionless precision, as if nothing had been learned or lost at all. "It doesn't make sense," Whitfield said one evening, studying battle data alongside Sella and Vesic aboard the Aegis Ascendant strategy room. "We've destroyed hundreds of their ships by now. Any normal military force would be adjusting tactics, changing strategy, showing some sign of learning from repeated defeat. They haven't changed anything." Sella frowned at the data, equally puzzled. "Concord scientists have wondered the same thing since the war began. Every Grave Swarm ship we've studied contains nearly identical technology, almost as if they are mass-produced from a single, unchanging design, rather than developed and improved over time like normal warships." Vesic pulled up additional records from earlier Concord research efforts. There have been theories, dismissed by most as speculation, that the Grave Swarm might not be a normal military force at all. Some researchers believe they could be remnants of something much older, an automated defense system left behind by a long-extinct civilization, still operating under original programming millennia after its creators disappeared. Whitfield leaned forward, intrigued despite the strangeness of the theory. An automated system with no living commanders, just following ancient orders on repeat? "It would explain their lack of adaptation," Sella said slowly, the pieces beginning to fit together. Machines built to fulfill a specific mission wouldn't necessarily need to evolve their tactics. They would only need to keep executing their original programming, regardless of cost or repeated failure. But why keep attacking at all? Whitfield asked. If they're just following old orders, what exactly are those orders supposed to accomplish? Nobody had an answer to that question, not yet. But 3 weeks later, during a joint assault on a heavily fortified grave swarm staging point deep within contested territory, human boarding teams managed something no Concord force had ever successfully achieved. They captured a disabled grave swarm command vessel largely intact, along with a portion of its core systems. The recovered data took Concord scientists and human engineers working together nearly 2 full weeks to properly decode. When they finally succeeded, what they discovered changed the entire understanding of the war. The grave swarm was not a conquering army, nor a hostile empire seeking territory or resources. It was exactly what Vesic had theorized, an ancient automated defense network, originally built by a long-vanished precursor civilization to eliminate what its original programming identified only as contamination sources, a term the system applied broadly to any advancing spacefaring civilization that expanded beyond a certain technological threshold. Somewhere in its ancient, damaged core programming, a fail-safe function had been corrupted or triggered incorrectly millennia ago, causing the system to permanently classify all nearby civilizations, Concord and otherwise, as contamination requiring immediate and total elimination. It was not malice. It was a broken machine, following flawed orders that its long-dead creators had never intended to run indefinitely. This changes everything, Sella said, during the emergency briefing, where the discovery was presented to combined command staff. If the grave swarm is truly just an automated system following corrupted programming, then defeating their ships alone will never end this war. More will always be built to replace them, following the exact same broken orders. Admiral Cassia studied the data with a grim expression. Then what do you propose, Admiral Whitfield? If we cannot win through direct military victory alone, what options remain? Whitfield was quiet for a long moment, studying the recovered data himself. Finally he spoke, his voice careful and deliberate. If it's a machine, following broken programming, then somewhere, there has to be a central system controlling that programming. Something that keeps producing new ships, new orders, new waves of attack. If we can find that source and shut it down, or corrupt its instructions the same way its original failsafe got corrupted, we might be able to stop this permanently, instead of fighting an endless war of attrition. The room fell into uneasy silence. It was an audacious plan, based on incomplete information and enormous assumptions about technology nobody fully understood. Vesic voiced what many were thinking. You are suggesting we attempt to locate and infiltrate the very source of this ancient system, likely defended more heavily than anything we have faced so far, based on partial data recovered from a single captured vessel. Yes, Whitfield said simply, because the alternative is fighting this exact same war forever, losing a little more each time, until eventually, we run out of ships, soldiers, or simply the will to keep fighting. It took several more days of careful analysis before human and Concord scientists working together managed to trace probable coordinates for what they believed was the grave swarm's central control system, hidden deep within a heavily fortified region of space that Concord scouts had previously avoided entirely due to extreme danger. The plan that emerged combined careful Concord strategic planning with the kind of bold, unconventional thinking that had defined human tactics since the war began. A strike force would be assembled, small enough to avoid detection during approach, but equipped with everything necessary to disable or corrupt the central system directly, assuming they could even reach it. Sella volunteered immediately to join the mission, citing her knowledge of ancient Concord historical records that might prove useful in understanding whatever they found. Whitfield agreed to lead the strike team personally once again, a decision that worried Concord Command deeply, given the mission's extreme risk. You are needed to command the broader fleet, Cassia argued during a private conversation before the mission's launch. If something happens to you during this operation, the forged fleet loses its most experienced commander at a critical moment. With respect, Admiral, Whitfield replied evenly. If this mission fails, it won't matter who's commanding the fleet afterward. We'll just keep losing this war slowly instead of quickly. I need to see this through myself. Preparations continued rapidly over the following week. Engineers worked to adapt human hacking and infiltration technology to interface with Concord and recovered Graveswarm systems, uncertain whether their equipment would even function properly against technology this ancient and unfamiliar. Soldiers trained specifically for the boarding operation, studying recovered schematics obsessively, memorizing every detail available about the enemy's likely internal layout. Marcus Webb, now a seasoned combat pilot after months of fighting, volunteered for the mission's support squadron, providing cover for the strike team's approach. When Sella asked him privately why he chose to risk himself on such a dangerous operation rather than remain with the relatively safer main fleet, his answer echoed something she had heard often from humans throughout the war. Because if there's a chance to actually end this instead of just surviving it one battle at a time, that's worth the risk, he said simply. We've lost too many people fighting the same fight over and over. Time to try ending it instead. As final preparations concluded, Whitfield gathered the strike team for one last briefing before departure. The room was filled with a mixture of humans and Concord soldiers, standing together not as separate allied forces anymore, but as something that had genuinely become unified through months of shared struggle and sacrifice. We don't know exactly what we're going to find out there, Whitfield told them honestly. We don't know if this plan will even work, but we know what happens if we don't try. So we're going to go in, we're going to adapt to whatever we find, the same way we've adapted to everything else in this war so far, and we're going to give this everything we have. Sella stood among the assembled soldiers, remembering the desperate message she had carried across the stars months earlier, remembering the doubts so many Concord leaders had expressed about trusting an unknown, disorganized species with the survival of an entire civilization. Looking now at the mixed group of human and Concord soldiers preparing together for what might be the most important mission of the entire war, she found herself believing, for the first time since this nightmare began, that they truly might succeed. The strike force departed within hours, moving quietly toward coordinates that would either end this war permanently or cost them everything trying. The strike force approached the coordinates in complete silence, engines running at minimum power, every system dimmed to avoid detection for as long as possible. 12 ships moved carefully through a dense field of ancient wreckage, remnants of battles fought long before humans, or even the Concord had begun exploring the stars. Whatever civilization had built the Graveswarm's control system had chosen to hide it well, surrounded by natural defenses that had clearly claimed other intruders over countless centuries. Aboard the lead ship, Whitfield studied sensor readings carefully as they drew closer to their target. Massive structure ahead. Matches the profile we projected from the recovered data. Looks like some kind of ancient orbital station, built into what's left of a shattered planetoid. Sella stared at the growing image on the main display, her expression unreadable. The structure was enormous, dark metal fused seamlessly with jagged remains of rock, clearly built by hands, or perhaps machines, far more advanced than anything currently active in known space. This technology predates even the earliest Concord historical records, she said quietly. We are looking at something far older than either of our civilizations. As the strike force moved into final approach range, automated defenses activated exactly as feared. Turrets built into the structure's outer hull began targeting the incoming ships with the same cold, mechanical precision the Graveswarm fleet had displayed throughout the war. Defensive systems engaging, Vesic reported from his ship. Recommend immediate evasive maneuvers. Fenrir, Kali, draw their fire and keep them occupied, Whitfield ordered calmly. Ragnarok, Valkyrie, cover the boarding shuttles. We need a clean approach to that main structure. What followed was a chaotic, dangerous dance through automated defense fire, human pilots once again relying on unpredictable maneuvers to avoid the station's disciplined, predictable targeting patterns. Marcus Webb led the support squadron directly into the heaviest concentration of enemy fire, weaving between defensive turrets with practiced precision, built from months of brutal combat experience. Boarding shuttles are clear, Marcus called out over comms, watching two small transport ships slip past the worst of the defensive fire toward a docking point identified earlier from recovered schematics. Good luck down there, Admiral. Whitfield, Sella, and a small team of specially trained human and Concord soldiers guided their shuttle carefully into a damaged docking bay, one of the few entry points their combined intelligence suggested might still be accessible after millennia of neglect and decay. The interior of the station was unlike anything either species had encountered before. Dark corridors lined with ancient machinery, still humming faintly with residual power, despite obvious signs of age and damage. Dust and debris from countless centuries covered every surface, yet the core systems clearly remained active, continuing their programmed function long after whoever built this place had vanished entirely. Systems still running after this long, Whitfield muttered, examining the strange technology surrounding them as the team moved cautiously deeper into the structure. Whoever built this really didn't want it to stop working. That may be exactly the problem, Sella replied grimly, studying readings from a portable scanner. A system built to run indefinitely, with nobody remaining to ever properly shut it down or correct its programming when something eventually went wrong. They encountered resistance almost immediately, automated defense units built into the station's walls activating as the team moved deeper inside. Firefights broke out in narrow corridors, human and Concord soldiers working together with practiced coordination, built from months of shared combat experience, clearing pathway after pathway toward the station's core systems. A young Concord soldier named Threll Dovin, a distant relative of Admiral Cassia herself, took a serious injury protecting the team's flank during one particularly difficult engagement. A human medic named Sarah Chen immediately moved to stabilize him, working quickly under continued fire from surrounding defense units. "We need to keep moving," Whitfield said grimly, watching Chen work. "Can he be moved?" "He can be moved," Chen confirmed, finishing emergency treatment, "but he needs proper medical attention soon." They pressed forward, finally reaching what appeared to be the station's central control chamber, a massive circular room dominated by an enormous, ancient computing core, still pulsing faintly with dim, ancient light. Sella immediately began working with portable scanning equipment, trying to interface Concord and human technology with a system unlike anything either species had ever attempted to access before. "I'm reading massive amounts of data here," Sella said, working quickly. "This is definitely the source. Every Grave Swarm ship, every attack pattern, all of it originates from this single core system. Can we shut it down?" Whitfield asked, watching the entrance nervously as more defensive units began converging on their position. "Not easily," Sella replied, frustration clear in her voice. "The system is designed to resist exactly this kind of interference. If I try to force a shutdown, it may trigger additional defensive protocols, or worse, accelerate its current directive instead of stopping it." Time was running short. Defensive units continued gathering outside the chamber, and Whitfield's team held their position with increasing difficulty as ammunition and energy reserves ran low. Sella worked desperately, combining her knowledge of ancient Concord technology with human hacking techniques developed specifically for this mission, searching for any way to properly correct the corrupted programming rather than simply attempting to force a shutdown. "There," she finally said, her voice filled with cautious hope. "I found the original fail-safe protocol, buried deep within the corrupted code. It was never meant to target every advancing civilization permanently. There's supposed to be a review process, a way to reassess threats individually, rather than applying blanket destruction indefinitely. Something in the original corruption disabled that review function entirely. Can you restore it?" Whitfield asked urgently, as defensive fire intensified against their position outside the chamber. "I believe so," Sella said, working rapidly, "but I need more time." Whitfield made a quick decision, calling for additional support from the ships still fighting outside the station. "Marcus, we need a diversion, something big enough to draw their remaining defenses away from our position for a few more minutes." Aboard the Ragnarok, Marcus Webb heard the request and immediately understood exactly what was being asked of him. Without hesitation, he directed his squadron toward the station's primary power relay systems, deliberately drawing maximum defensive attention away from the boarding team's position deep inside the structure. "Hitting their power core directly," Marcus called out, guiding his ship through increasingly dangerous defensive fire. This should keep them plenty busy. The resulting explosion rocked the entire station, drawing exactly the reaction Marcus had hoped for, as defensive systems throughout the structure redirected significant resources toward containing the sudden threat to their power infrastructure. Inside the control chamber, Sella took advantage of the brief reduction in defensive activity to complete her work. "Almost there," she said, sweat visible on her brow despite the chamber's cold temperature. "Just need to finalize the correction sequence." With one final input, Sella activated the restored fail-safe protocol. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Lights throughout the ancient chamber began shifting, defensive systems around the station gradually powering down as the corrupted directive was finally, properly overridden with its original, long-buried programming. Outside, grave swarm ships across the entire war front began receiving new instructions simultaneously, their aggressive attack patterns halting abruptly as the source system finally properly reassessed the civilizations it had been blindly attacking for so long. It was not an instant end to the conflict. Remaining active ships still required proper deactivation or careful negotiation, depending on their individual programming responses, but the endless flood of new attacks finally stopped completely. The battle at the station itself continued for several more tense hours, as remaining defensive units gradually powered down or were carefully neutralized by the strike force and supporting fleet. When the fighting finally ended, exhausted human and Concord soldiers stood together amid the ancient wreckage, staring at what remained of a system that had terrorized the galaxy for over a year. News of the victory spread rapidly across both fleets, then across Concord space entirely, then eventually reaching Earth itself. The Grave Swarm, an enemy that had seemed unstoppable only months earlier, had finally been stopped, not through overwhelming military force alone, but through the combined strength, sacrifice, and stubborn determination of two very different civilizations working together. Weeks later, at a formal ceremony held aboard the newly repaired Aegis Ascendant, Admiral Cassia stood before assembled human and Concord representatives, preparing to address both fleets together for the first time since the war's official end. "When we first sent our plea for help," Cassia said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, "many among my people doubted that a species as young and disorganized as humanity could offer any meaningful assistance against a threat as ancient and overwhelming as the one we faced. We were wrong to doubt so completely." Beside her, Admiral Whitfield studied the crowd of human and Concord soldiers standing together, many bearing visible scars from months of brutal fighting, all united now by something far stronger than simple alliance. "Humanity did not defeat this threat through superior technology or careful, patient strategy," Cassia continued. "You defeated it through something far rarer, the stubborn refusal to accept defeat, combined with the wisdom to recognize when brute force alone would not be enough. You call yourselves a young species, still learning your place among the stars. I believe today proves exactly the opposite. Today, you have shown this galaxy what true strength looks like." Sella stood near the front of the gathered crowd, watching the ceremony with quiet pride, remembering her desperate journey months earlier, carrying a message of hope toward a species everyone had doubted. Beside her, Marcus Webb and Threll Dovan, now fully recovered from his injuries, stood together, an unlikely friendship forged through shared danger and sacrifice. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked quietly, watching the formal proceedings continue. "Now," Sella replied, smiling slightly, "the galaxy finally learns your species' name properly, not as some distant, unknown threat, but as allies who answered a desperate call for help when nobody else could." Far beyond the ceremony, across countless worlds throughout Concord space, stories continued spreading about the forged fleet, a legend born not from ancient prophecy or careful planning, but from raw human determination, combined with hard-won Concord wisdom. Humanity, a species once dismissed as too young and disorganized to matter, had proven itself capable of standing among the stars, not merely as guests within a much older galactic community, but as a power the entire galaxy would now have to respect. As the ceremony concluded and both fleets began preparing for the long journey home, Admiral Whitfield allowed himself a rare moment of quiet reflection, watching Earth's distant sun barely visible even from this great distance. The war was finally over, but something new had clearly begun. Humanity's true arrival, on a much larger stage than anyone back home could have imagined, when that first alien ship crashed into the Pacific Ocean, carrying nothing but a desperate plea and the fragile hope that somewhere, someone might actually answer the call. They had answered, and in doing so, they had forged something the entire galaxy would remember for generations to come.